The third night of the season, in the long ballroom at Hartcombe House, the music stopped between dances and did not begin again, because a woman no one had invited was standing at the bottom of the great stair with a single letter held against her breast. She wore gray, not the gray of fashion which the season favored that year in silk and silver thread, but the gray of a gown turned and pressed too many times, its hem darkened where the rain of the courtyard had touched it. Her gloves did not match her sleeves. Her hair had been pinned by her own hand, and not a maid's, and one strand had come loose at her temple and lay there, against skin gone pale with cold. She did not look up at the chandeliers. She looked instead at the faces turning toward her, one after another, the way a field turns under wind, and she held the letter as though it were the only warm thing left in the room. Lady Caravale, who was hostess that night and dowager of a house that had buried two of its sons and kept its diamonds, lowered her fan a half-inch and said, to the woman beside her, and not quietly enough, that someone had let a beggar in from the street. The word traveled. It always did. By the time it reached the far wall, it had become a small certainty held by 200 people, that the gray woman at the stair was nothing, was no one, was a creature who had wandered in from the wet dark, and would presently be removed. What none of them knew, what not one of them could have read in the plain set of her mouth, was that she had walked 11 miles that day to deliver the letter in her hands, and that the letter once opened would empty 3 of the great houses of their certainties before the spring was out. Her name was Eleanor Vane. She was 26, which the season counted as old, and she had come from a village in the north that none of these people could have found on a map, and she had come because a dying man had asked her to. That much she knew. The rest of it, the part that would undo them, she did not yet understand herself. She had been told only to put the letter into the hand of the Duke of Ashworth and no other, and to wait while he read it, and to answer what he asked. She had not been told that the Duke of Ashworth was the tall man standing apart from the dancing at the terrace doors, his back half to the room, a man whose stillness the whole gathering arranged itself around without seeming to. If you have ever watched a room decide what a person is worth before that person has spoken a word, you already know how this began. Stay with it. The room was wrong, and it would learn how wrong, and the learning would be the whole of the story. The Duke of Ashworth had not danced in 3 years. The season knew the shape of his grief without knowing its center, the way one knows a house is shuttered without knowing which room the body lay in. He had married young and buried his wife and infant son in the same hard winter, and he had come back to society because his sister begged him and his estate required an heir, and the world did not stop for a man's sorrow, however large. He stood at the terrace doors because the cold air there was honest. He had been watching the rain on the stone when the music stopped, and he turned, as the whole room turned, and he saw the gray woman at the stair, and something in him went very still in a different way than before. He did not know her. He was certain of that. And yet the letter in her hand wore a seal. He knew better than his own name. A seal pressed in dark wax with a device of a heron, and a broken oar, and that seal belonged to a man, 3 years dead, a man Ashworth had loved and failed, and never spoken of again. He crossed the room. He did not hurry, because a duke does not hurry, but he crossed it, and the crowd that had been deciding to remove Eleanor Vane parted in front of Eleanor without understanding why, and Lady Caravale's fan stopped moving entirely. He stopped before her. Up close she was smaller than the stair had made her seem, and tired in a way that went past one day's walking, and her eyes, when she raised them to his, were a clear gray-green and entirely unafraid. He had expected fear. Everyone was afraid of him now. Grief had made him into a thing people stepped around. She was not afraid. She was only watching him the way she had watched the room, taking his measure, and he found absurdly that he wanted to pass. "You are the Duke of Ashworth," she said. It was not a question. "I am." "Then this is yours." She held out the letter. "He said you were to read it alone. I've come a long way to give it to you, and I will not give it to anyone else, and I will not leave until you have read it." A woman did not speak to a duke so in a ballroom. The nearest listeners drew breath. But Ashworth looked down at the heron and the broken oar, and his hand, when he took the letter, was not quite steady, and the room saw that too. He turned the letter over once. He read the direction in a hand he knew. And without a word to the 200 people watching, he said, "Come with me." And he led her out of the ballroom and into the dark of the house. And the music did not begin again for a long time. Pull back now before the letter is opened, because to understand what it broke, you must first understand what it found. Whole Eleanor Vane had not always worn turned gray. Her father had been a clergyman of no fortune but considerable learning, and she had been raised on Latin and kindness in a stone house with a leaking roof, and when he died, she had taken a position as companion to an old woman in the next county and learned that the world had a use for her that was not a life. The old woman died. The position ended. Eleanor went home to nurse a neighbor through his last illness, because there was no one else. And that neighbor was the man who gave her the letter, and his name was a name she had been told never to speak in the South. He had been a sailor once, and then something more than a sailor, and he had come to her village 20 years before with money no one could account for, and a silence he never broke. The village called him Mr. Heron, for the bird on his ring, and let him be. He paid his rent and kept his garden and asked nothing of anyone, and only at the very end, with the fever burning the last cents from him, did he speak of who he had been. He had been steward to the old Duke of Ashworth, the present Duke's father. He had carried a secret across an ocean and buried it in the north, and lived 20 years on the silence of it. And dying, he could not bear the silence into the grave. "There is a child," he told Eleanor, in the last clear hour he had. "There was a child, and a marriage no one would own, and a name that was stolen and given to the wrong house. 3 families built their fortunes on a lie. I helped them tell I cannot mend it, but you can carry it where it must go. Put this into the young Duke's hand. He is the only honest one of them. He will know what to do, and it will cost him, and that is why it must be him." She had not understood it. She did not understand it, now walking through the dark corridors of Hartcombe House at the side of a duke whose face had gone the color of the winter glass. But she had given her word to a dying man, and she kept her word, because keeping it was the only wealth she had ever been permitted to own. He took her to the library. It was a vast room, candlelit, its shelves rising into shadow, and he closed the door and stood with his back to her and broke the seal. She watched him read. She watched the line of his shoulders, the careful stillness of a man holding himself together by main force, and she saw the moment the words reached him because his hand came up and pressed flat against the shelf, as though the house had moved beneath him. He read it twice. When he turned, his eyes were wet and his voice was level, and the contrast between the two was the most human thing she had seen in months. "Do you know what this says?" "No, Your Grace." "He sealed it." "I do not read other people's letters." "You walked 11 miles in the rain to deliver a letter you cannot read, from man the world believes dead, to a stranger who might have had you thrown into the street." "He was kind to me," she said simply, "and I gave my word." The Duke of Ashworth looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight, and Eleanor felt the look the way one feels the first warmth after a long cold in the skin, first in the understanding after. She did not move. She had learned long ago to stand very still when the world was deciding about her. But her heartbeat had gone loud in her own ears, and she suspected he could see the pulse jump at her throat, and she resented her own body for telling him a truth her mouth would never have allowed. "Sit down," he said. "You are swaying on your feet, and you have not eaten today, and I will not have you faint in my library. Sit down. I will send for something." She heard the command. She did not yet hear the care beneath it. She sat, because her legs had, in fact, begun to fail her, and she watched him ring for a servant and order soup and bread in a voice that brooked no delay, and she thought, "This is a hard man," and she was wrong, and the being wrong was the beginning of everything. The letter in plain words said this: 27 years before, the old Duke of Ashworth had married a woman in secret, a gentlewoman of small family whom his own father forbade him to wed, and she had borne him a son. and the old duke, weak where his father was strong, had let the marriage be hidden and the child be given out as the orphaned ward of a distant cousin. That cousin was the present Earl of Brentmoor. The child, raised as Brentmoor's heir, was now the Earl himself, a man who believed his blood common and his title bought, and who had married his daughter into the house of Caravaille to buy the respectability his uncertain origins denied him. The secret marriage made that child legitimate. Legitimate. He was the elder son of the old duke. Elder son, he was the rightful Duke of Ashworth, and the man who had sat in the library with the letter in his hand, the man Eleanor had walked 11 miles to find, was not the Duke at all, and never had been, and had built his whole grief-shadowed life on a title that belonged to another. Mr. Heron had carried the proof across the ocean and buried it, because the old Duke, dying, had begged him to protect the younger son, the boy who would otherwise inherit nothing. He had kept it 20 years out of love for a dead man. And he had sent it south at last, because love for the dead is not the same as justice for the living, and because a man cannot mend a lie by taking it into the dark with him. 3 houses. Brentmoor, whose earl was secretly a duke. Caravaille, whose daughter had married a man whose true rank and fortune were nothing like what she had been promised, and Ashworth itself, whose grieving master held a title that was not his. The letter would empty all 3 of their certainties, exactly as Mr. Dixey, Heron had said. And the man holding it understood within the space of 2 readings that the honorable course and the ruinous course were the same course, and that this was precisely why the dying steward had sent the proof to him, and not to any of the others. He chose well, Ashworth said almost to himself. He folded the letter. He looked at Eleanor, who was eating bread now, with the careful restraint of a person who had been hungry too often to gulp at food, and he found that the sight of her steadied him. He told you I was the honest one. He was warning me what it would cost. He knew I would not be able to keep it quiet, and he knew the cost of speaking, and he sent it to me anyway, because he trusted me to pay it. That is either the cruelest thing a dying man has ever done to me, or the greatest compliment, and I cannot yet tell which. What does it cost? She asked. She had not meant to. It was not her business. But she had carried the weight 11 miles, and she found she needed to know what she had been carrying. Everything, he said. My name, my house, my place in the world. It costs me everything. And the man it gives everything to does not know he wants it. And the families it ruins will fight it with every weapon they have. And the only person in England who can prove a word of it is a clergyman's daughter in a turned gray gown who walked here in the rain. He almost smiled. It did not reach his eyes, but it moved his mouth, and Eleanor thought it was the saddest and most honest thing she had ever seen a face do. What is your name? Eleanor Vane. Miss Vane, he said, in the formal courtesy of it offered to a woman the ballroom had called a beggar an hour before, did something to her chest that she did not have a word for. You have walked into the middle of something very old and very dangerous, and you cannot now walk out of it because you are the only witness to how the letter came to me and what state its seal was in. I am sorry for that. I will see that you are protected and provided for. But I will not be able to send you home, and I think you knew that when you chose to come. She had not known it, but she found, looking at him, that she was not sorry. Word of the Grey Woman and the Duke's strange exit ran through the season faster than any letter could have. By morning it was known in 40 drawing rooms that the Duke of Ashworth had left his own dance with a beggar on his arm, and the season, which had no facts, supplied them. Lady Caravaille, who had called Eleanor a beggar to 200 witnesses, found the story repeated to her at 3 separate calls, and corrected it each time with the same cool certainty. The woman was an adventuress, plainly, some northern schemer who had got wind of the Duke's grief and meant to prey on it. And she would be exposed and removed within the week. The dowager believed this entirely. She had built her life on knowing the worth of people at a glance, and she did not intend to be wrong about a creature in a turned gown. Ashworth had Eleanor lodged with his widowed sister, Lady Margaret, in a quiet house in a respectable street, with a maid and a fire and a wardrobe that did not match her station because her station was now an open question. Lady Margaret, who had spent 3 years watching her brother turn to stone, took one look at the gray-green eyes, and the unbroken back, and the way the stranger thanked the maid by name within an hour of arriving, and decided to like her, and said so to her brother that evening, with the bluntness only a sister has. "She is not what they are saying," Margaret told him. "She is frightened and exhausted, and entirely without guile, and she keeps trying to help my servants with their work, because she does not know how to sit and be waited on. An adventuress would know how. You have brought home an honest woman, Henry, and you have ruined her reputation doing it, and you had better know what you mean to do about that." He did not have an answer. He had a letter that would unmake him and a witness he could not protect by ordinary means, and a feeling he had no right to that grew every time he entered the room where Eleanor was. He told himself it was gratitude. He told himself it was the natural protectiveness of a man toward a person he had endangered. He was a careful man and an honest one, and he lied to himself about this one thing for as long as he could, which was not very long because Eleanor had a way of saying exactly the true thing in the middle of a careful conversation, and the truth in her undid the lies in him a little more each time. In the second week he took her to his solicitor, an old man named Mr. Pelham, who had served the Ashworth house for 40 years, and whose discretion was the only kind that could be trusted with a secret that could topple an earldom. Pelham read the letter. He read it a second time, and a third, and he set it down on the green leather of his desk and removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose for a long while before he spoke. "This is the Steward Heron's hand," he said at last. "I knew it of old. I witnessed documents he wrote out for your father, your Grace, and I would know that hand in my sleep." He looked at Eleanor with new attention. "And you nursed him at the end he spoke to you. You can swear to the state of the seal, the unbroken wax, the manner of its giving. You are the chain that connects this paper to a dead man's deathbed, Miss Vane, and without you, it is only ink. With you, it is proof." "I can swear to all of it," Eleanor said. "Then you are the most important person in 3 counties, said Pelham, "and the most endangered, and I would not give a great deal for your safety once the Earl of Brentmore learns you exist." She had stopped being frightened of large rooms full of strangers. She found she could be frightened of this. But she met the old man's eyes, and she said, "He asked me to carry it, where it must go. I have carried it. I will not put it down now because the road has grown dangerous. That is not what carrying a thing means." Ashworth, standing by the window, turned to look at her, and Pelham, who had known the Duke since he was a boy in short coats, saw the look on his face and said nothing. But he wrote a private note that evening to a colleague that the matter of the Ashworth succession had grown more complicated than the law alone could account for. The Earl of Brentmore learned she existed 9 days later, and the season's quiet poison turned overnight into something colder. The Earl was a heavy, confident man of 50, who had spent his life uneasy about his origins, and had bought his ease with money and marriages, and the rumor of a letter touching the old Duke's history reached him through a servant he paid for exactly such things. He did not yet know what the letter said. He knew only that a strange woman had come south with papers that touched his name, and he had not survived in a world that despised his uncertain blood by waiting to find out what such things meant. He called on Lady Caravale, whose daughter he had bought for his line, and he found the Dowager already his ally, and between them they decided that the Grey Woman must be discredited, ruined, and sent back north before she could speak whatever she had come to say. The campaign was elegant and it was vicious, and it never once raised its voice. A word here that the Duke's northern companion had been a paid nurse of doubtful character. A word there that she had been turned out of her last position for theft, that the old woman she had served had died suspiciously. That money had gone missing. None of it was true. All of it was sayable, and in the season sayable was nearly the same as true. Eleanor felt the change before she understood it. The tradesman who had been civil grew cold. An invitation Lady Margaret had secured for her was withdrawn, with an excuse too thin to be anything but a message. And one gray afternoon, in the 3rd week, in a milliner's shop on a fashionable street, a woman Eleanor had never met looked at her across the counter and said, loudly enough for the whole shop to hear, that some people did not know their place, and would do well to crawl back to whatever gutter had produced them. Eleanor stood very still, as she had learned to do. She did not weep. She paid for her small purchase, and she thanked the milliner, who would not meet her eyes, and she walked out into the street with her back straight and her face calm. And only when she had turned the corner did she stop and put one gloved hand flat against the cold stone of a wall and breathe until the shaking stopped. She had been called a beggar in a ballroom, and an adventuress in 40 drawing-rooms, and now a creature of the gutter in a shop full of strangers, and the dismissive word followed her wherever the season's verdict reached, and she understood for the first time the full machinery of what she had walked into. It was not that they thought her low. It was that her lowness was useful to them because a low woman cannot be believed. And a woman who cannot be believed cannot testify. And a witness who cannot testify is no danger to 3 great houses at all. She did not tell Ashworth about the milliner's shop. She did not have to. He had men of his own in the season's undergrowth, and he knew within a day what had been said to her and where. And that night he came to his sister's house, with his jaw set like carved stone, and asked to speak with Miss Vane alone, and Lady Margaret, who saw everything, found a reason to be elsewhere. "They are trying to destroy you," he said. "Brentmore and Lady Caravale. They do not know what the letter says, only that you carry something that frightens them, and they mean to make you unbelievable before you can be heard. I should have foreseen it. I should have protected you better. I am sorry. You cannot protect a person from words," Eleanor said. "I learned that a long time ago. Words go where they like." She was sitting by the fire, with her hands folded, and the firelight was on her face, and she looked at him with the clear directness that had stopped him in the ballroom. "I am not afraid of being called names, Your Grace. I have been called names by better people than the Earl of Brentmore. I am afraid of one thing only, which is that they will succeed, and the letter will be buried again. And a man who does not know he was wronged will die wronged, and the dying wish I carried 11 miles will have been for nothing. That is the only thing that frightens me." He crossed the room. He had not meant to. He stood before her chair and looked down at her, and the careful distance he had kept for 3 weeks closed to almost nothing, and his voice when he spoke was lower than she had heard it. "It will not be for nothing," he said. "I give you my word, and my word, Miss Vane, is the one thing in this affair that all 3 of those houses still believe in, because it is the only thing about me they have not yet learned is false." He paused. "Do you know that you are the only person who has spoken the truth to me since the night you arrived? Everyone else weighs every word for how it will fall. You simply say what is. I had forgotten what that sounded like. I find I cannot do without it." Now Eleanor's breath caught. She was aware of his nearness in every part of her, the warmth of him, the clean scent of cold air and leather that he carried, the way the candlelight moved on the hard planes of his face. Her hands wanted to unfold. She kept them still by an act of will that cost her more than the 11 miles had. She had spent her whole life not wanting things she could not have, and she had been good at it, and she discovered in that moment by the fire that she was not good at it any longer, and that the wanting had a name she did not dare say even silently. "You should not say such things to me," she managed. "I am a clergyman's daughter, in a borrowed gown. And you are a duke, and even if you are not a duke after the letter does its work, you are still a great deal more than I am. It is not kind to make me forget that." "I am not being kind," he said. "I have not been kind to anyone in 3 years. I am being honest, which is different and rarer, and you taught me the difference without meaning to." He reached out, and his hand stopped a breath from her face, hovering, not arriving the way a man stops at the edge of something he cannot undo. "I want to tell you what the letter costs me, and I want you to understand that I am choosing to pay it. And that part of why I can choose it is that you walked into my ballroom and reminded me there are things worth more than a name." "May I tell you?" "Yes," she whispered. So he told her about his wife and his son dead in one winter, and the 3 years of stone, and the way the letter had felt like grief and like rescue both at once. Because to lose his title was to lose the last thing tying him to a life he had only been enduring. He told her in a low voice, with his hand not quite touching her face, that he had been waiting 3 years to feel something other than loss, and had given up expecting to, and that he had felt it the moment she looked at him in the ballroom without fear. It was the most a man of his discipline had said aloud in years, and he said it to her, and Eleanor, who had been wanted by no one freely in all her 26 years, understood that she was being wanted freely now. The understanding was almost more than she could bear. She did not let him touch her face. She turned her cheek into his palm for the space of one breath, and then she drew back, because she was honest too, and honesty required her to say it. If you say these things to me and the letter ruins you, you will have nothing to offer, and I will have lost the place that protects me, and the truth I came to tell will be tangled up with a scandal about a duke and his nurse. We must not. Not yet. Not until the letter has done what it came to do. If there is anything after, it must be after, when it can be clean. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he stepped back and he bowed. An actual bow, the kind a duke gives a lady, and it was the most eloquent thing he could have done. "You are right," he said. "You are nearly always right. It is a quality I find I cannot resist, which is unfortunate, because it means I am going to spend the rest of this affair doing what you tell me." And for the first time in 3 years, very briefly, something moved at the corner of his mouth that was almost amusement, and Eleanor saw it, and knew what it had cost, and treasured it. The law moved slowly, as the law does, but it moved. Pelham filed the necessary petitions in the necessary quarters, quietly, while the Earl of Brentmore's campaign of rumor raged above the surface and accomplished nothing the old solicitor could not anticipate. The proof was sound. The steward's hand was attested. The register of the secret marriage was traced to a country church in the West, where an old vicar, near death himself, remembered the ceremony and had the entry to show. And Eleanor Vane, the clergyman's daughter, the season had called a beggar and an adventuress and a creature of the gutter, sat for 2 long days in a paneled room and gave her testimony to grave men in wigs, plainly and without faltering, and her plainness, which the Earl had counted on to make her unbelievable, was the very thing that made her impossible to disbelieve. She did not embellish. She did not weep for effect. She said what was, and the grave men in wigs, who had spent their lives listening to people who said what was useful, recognized the difference and believed her. The Earl of Brentmore learned what the letter said 3 days before the matter was to be made public, and the learning broke something in him that the rumor-mongering had concealed. He came to Pelham's chambers uninvited, a heavy man gone gray in the face, and he asked, not as an earl but as a man, whether it was true that he was the old duke's son. Pelham, who was kind beneath his caution, told him gently that it was, that he had been born in wedlock to the old Duke of Ashworth and a gentlewoman named in the register, and that he was, therefore, and had always been the rightful duke, and that the title, and the great house, and the fortune that went with them, were his, by a right, no court. The Earl sat down heavily in a chair that was too small for him. He had spent 50 years ashamed of blood. He believed common. He had bought his daughter a marriage to cover the shame. And now he was told the shame had never existed, that he had been a duke's true son all along, and that the man who brought him this gift had ruined himself to do it. He asked to see Ashworth. The meeting between them was private, and neither man ever fully described it. But Eleanor, who waited in the next room, heard the low voices go on for an hour, and heard near the end the unmistakable sound of a large, proud man weeping, and heard the younger man's voice, level and kind, telling him it was not a loss but a setting right, and that the steward who had hidden it had done it out of love and confessed it out of conscience, and that there was no dishonor anywhere in it, except in the families who had profited from the silence and would now have to account for themselves. The public reversal, when it came in the same long ballroom at Harcombe House where it had begun, at the season's last great dance, because Lady Caravale, who did not yet fully understand what was about to happen to her certainties, had insisted on holding it, and the rightful duke had asked that it be held there, and Ashworth had agreed. Because some things must end in the room where they began. Eleanor came on Lady Margaret's arm. She wore a gown of soft green that Margaret had pressed upon her, and that she had finally stopped refusing, and her hair was dressed by a maid's hand, and she was beautiful in a way the season had refused to see, and the season saw it now and did not know what to do with the seeing. The whispers started the moment she entered the old words. Beggar and adventuress and creature, but they were uncertain now because the grave man in wigs had been talking, and the season could smell a shift in the weather before it could name it. The rightful duke was presented to the room. He was a heavy grey man who had been an earl that morning, and was a duke by nightfall, and he stood with a dignity that his 50 uneasy years had not allowed him until that day, and the room performed the deep collective adjustment of a society rearranging its entire map in the space of a single announcement. And then the man they had all called the Duke of Ashworth, the man who had just given away his title and his house and his fortune to set right a dead man's lie, stepped into the center of the ballroom, and the music stopped, exactly as it had stopped on the third night of the season, and 200 people turned to him the way a field turns under wind. Lady Caravel's fan was at the wrong height. She had built her life on knowing the worth of people at a glance, and she had called the most important woman in 3 counties a beggar in front of 200 witnesses. And she understood now, watching the no longer Duke cross the floor toward the gray green-eyed woman in soft green, that she had been wrong in the one way a woman of her certainty cannot afford to be wrong, publicly and entirely and beyond any retrieval. He stopped before Eleanor. The room held its breath. He had given away everything that made him a great match, and the season knew it, and the season expected him to disappear quietly into reduced circumstances as ruined men did. Instead, he took Eleanor Vane's hand in front of all of them, and he raised his voice just enough, and he said, the only words he had prepared, the words he had turned over for 3 weeks. "This is the woman I intend to marry." 9 words. The silence after them was total. Lady Caravel's hand came up to her throat and stayed there. The whispers did not start again, because there was nothing left to whisper. The man had said the unsayable thing plainly, and a plain thing said plainly leaves no room for poison. Eleanor's hand in his did not tremble, though her heart was a wild thing in her chest because she had learned long ago to stand very still when the world was deciding about her, and the world was deciding now. And for once it was deciding in her favor, and she met its eyes the way she had met the rooms on the night she arrived, unafraid. The newly made Duke, the heavy gray man, stepped forward then, and in a voice rough with the day's weeping, he said that Miss Vane had carried his rightful name 11 miles in the rain, at the request of a dying man, and had borne every insult the season could invent, rather than put down the truth she had been given to carry, and that any house which had slandered her would answer to him, and that he counted her the most honorable person in the room, himself included. It was not a long speech. It did not need to be. The season recalculated its map a second time in one evening, and Eleanor, who had entered the ballroom a beggar, stood at its center an hour later, a woman 2 dukes had publicly defended, and the dowager who had named her was left holding a fan at the wrong height with nothing to say. Lady Caravel was not destroyed. The man who had been Ashworth would not allow it, and Eleanor would not have wanted it. The dowager was corrected, which is a worse thing for a proud woman than ruin, because ruin can be borne with dignity and correction cannot. She approached Eleanor near the end of the evening, stiff and pale, and offered the smallest possible apology, the kind that costs the giver everything and the receiver nothing. And Eleanor, who had been called a beggar by this woman in front of 200 people, took the apology gently and said only that the season was a hard place to be a stranger in, and that she bore no one any ill will, and that she hoped the dowager's family would find their way to the new arrangement with grace. It was the most merciful thing she could have said, and it was the most devastating. And Lady Caravel walked away from it understanding at last exactly what she had failed to see. They were married in the spring quietly, in the country far from the season and its verdicts. He was not a duke any longer. He had a smaller estate that had come to him through his mother, and a name without a title, and a great deal less money than the season had once thought him worth, and he had never in his life been happier. And he told Eleanor so, on the morning of their wedding, with the rare, almost smile, that she had learned to read like weather. The newly made Duke of Ashworth, the heavy grey man who had been an earl, stood up with them, as a kind of father, having no one else to give the bride away and wanting the office, and he wept again, more easily this time, and called Eleanor sister, and meant it. They lived in the north, not so very far from the village, where Mr. Heron had kept his garden and his silence for 20 years. The proof Eleanor had carried sat now in the proper archives. The marriage owned, the lie unmade, the three families settled into their true shapes. And none of that was the thing she kept. The thing she kept was small. On a shelf in their sitting room, in a plain wooden box that had been the steward's, lay the ring with the heron and the broken oar, given to her at the end by the dying man as a token that she had been trusted, and beside it, the letter, its seal broken now, its work done. On winter evenings she would take the ring out and turn it in the firelight while her husband read beside her, and she would think of the man who had carried a secret across an ocean out of love, and let it go at the last, out of conscience. And she would be glad she had answered the door that day, glad she had given her word, glad she had walked the 11 miles in the rain. Her husband looked up from his book one such evening and watched her turn the ring in the light, and he did not ask what she was thinking, because after a year of marriage, he knew, and he reached across the small distance between their chairs and covered her hand with his, the ring warm now between their palms. And outside the window the first snow of the season was falling soft and slow over the dark northern hills, settling on the garden a dead man had once kept. And neither of them said anything at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying, and the silence in that room was the warm kind, the kind that two people make when they have come at last to the place they were meant to be. If Eleanor's long walk in the rain stayed with you, stay a moment longer and tell me which part you carry away, for these are stories of the ones the world refused to see, and they are better for being witnessed. The fire burned low. The snow kept falling, and the ring with the heron and the broken oar lay warm between two hands that had finally stopped being afraid of what the world might decide.